Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be looking at an unusual experiment in community and social living in India known as Auroville. With me is Professor Debashish Banerji, who is the Haridas Chaudhuri Professor of Indian Philosophies and Cultures. He is also the chairman of the Department of East-West Psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. He is the author of Seven Quartets of Becoming, which is his interpretation of the yoga psychology of Shri Aurobindo, and is the editor of the recently published anthology, Critical Posthumanism and Planetary Futures. Welcome, Debashish.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Your work has had a strong influence from Shri Aurobindo, and I suppose one must say that Shri Aurobindo is the spiritual father of Auroville. It's in effect named for him.
That's true. That's absolutely true. Though he was not its founder, it was his partner and collaborator, Mira Alfassa, also known as The Mother, who founded Auroville. But she was putting into form some of his ideas, particularly his social and political ideas for a future society.
And now the interesting thing there, as soon as you introduce The Mother, we're already talking about a very cosmopolitan approach. And in our earlier interview on the Bengal Renaissance, that cosmopolitan cultural influence which was shared by Aurobindo was an important thing. Mira Alfassa was originally of Jewish Sephardic ancestry and had extensive background in Kabbalah before she went to India and met Aurobindo.
That's quite true. That's quite true. And since you brought in the Bengal Renaissance, yes, I'd say that the kind of thinking of the Bengal Renaissance flowered in societies like Auroville. With Tagore, it flowered in Shantiniketan and the educational and creative community that he founded there. And with Shri Aurobindo, it flowered in Pondicherry. But even more properly, I think it flowers now in Auroville. And you're quite right that the coming together of two spiritual traditions between Shri Aurobindo and The Mother, Eastern and Western spiritual lineages, both of them plural in themselves, modern reinventions of the history of spirituality in East and West, finding a modern form in Auroville is very interesting and cosmopolitan, future-oriented.
And when was Auroville founded?
In 1968, Jeffrey. 1968, as you know, just 50 years from now, was one of the peaks of what we know today as the counterculture.
Yes.
In America.
And not just the counterculture. That's the year that man first walked on the moon.
So many things. Man walked on the moon. Many other very significant things happened that year. There were tragic events as well.
Yes.
The death of Kennedy, the death of Martin Luther King. So an extremely important year. But I think it in a sense brings these energies into a focus in events like the founding of Auroville, which was a kind of an answer to the aspirations of the time, or at least a promise, looking towards the answering the aspirations of the time.
Now, Auroville, as I understand it, is completely distinct from the ashram that Shri Aurobindo and the Mother had created in the nearby town of Pondicherry.
That's quite right. It's very close. about 6 kilometers south of, I think north of Pondicherry, of the ashram of Shri Aurobindo and the Mother. And it is very different, it's distinct, it's different, but it's also geared towards some of the same goals as the ashram in Pondicherry. The ashram in Pondicherry grew up around Shri Aurobindo and the Mother as teacher figures, and in the Indian spiritual tradition, guru figures. While Auroville seeks to have no guru figures, it's really an experiment in what Shri Aurobindo was calling spiritual anarchy as a political form. It also is different because it's international, and it is a self-governing international community that doesn't have, or at least even in its founding, is not supposed to have any religion. So by not having any religion, we mean it's really a post-secular form. No religions in a traditional sense, but what today we call spiritual but not religious.
Well, I imagine that some of our viewers may not really fully appreciate the spiritual role of the guru. In Indian tradition, we sometimes think of a guru as a teacher, but in Indian tradition, a guru can be much more than that.
Yes, a guru in the Indian tradition is a very, the word guru means heavy. So he's a heavy in that sense. And heavy in the sense that they can take spiritual responsibility of your life, of your spiritual life. A guru really takes you in as almost like a spiritual son or daughter, and can help you to flower. It takes responsibility for your spiritual life, not just gives you lessons. So from that point of view, the idea of the guru is very significant, mysterious, has many dimensions to it, including authority dimensions that are problematic, and particularly when looked at from the viewpoint of modernity, is a cultural contradiction to some of the values of the Enlightenment.
And certainly contradicts the Western notion of the rugged individual who would not give up authority over their own spiritual evolution.
Quite true, quite true. So that becomes another very large discussion on what exactly is the guru, and what are the kind of dividing lines of individuality, where individuality ends and the role of the guru begins, and whether even it's possible to bring that into the context of modernity. There are lots of problems that we see around us, because guru figures have come to the West from India in the 60s. And many of them, have had some relative success, and many of them have created many problems. People have had sort of many difficulties with gurus in the West.
Now, you and I, 3 years ago, did a whole series of interviews describing the evolution of Shri Aurobindo on his path from a political revolutionary to a very significant spiritual figure. And in response to those interviews, occasionally I would hear from devotees who really treated Aurobindo and the Mother in a worshipful manner, almost like deities.
Quite true. So I would say, coming to our topic of Auroville, that to some extent, at least in my understanding, the Mother founded Auroville to create another form which would stay away from an overtly worshipful attitude towards personalities. That it would be a kind of a space where individuals would explore their own possibilities and arrive at the goals that Shri Aurobindo and the Mother had set for the human future. And what could be those goals? I'd say, in a way, the quintessence of the teaching of Shri Aurobindo is that of integration. He calls his spiritual path integral yoga. And integral yoga he's looking at it in his text mostly as psychological integration. So he sees us as fragmented forms. We have a body and we have life instincts, we have emotions, we have a mind which thinks, and all these are heterogeneous, independent forms of consciousness. How do we integrate them? This becomes the psychological question that he's looking at from the viewpoint of yoga. But I think with Auroville, we have to look at his social and political texts as well. There are two other really major components that come into the question of integration. So it's psychological integration, but added to that is cultural integration. And then there is ecological integration, the integration of land and of the earth. Because by the time the mother founded Auroville, new problems have arisen in human society and consciousness. The technology is one of them. We've become much more mediated by technology in our times than when Shri Aurobindo was writing.
When did Shri Aurobindo die?
In 1950.
1950. Yeah. So after his death, the mother essentially ran that ashram for 18 years before Auroville was founded.
That's quite right. That's quite right. And yes, so technology becomes much more prominent. It creates a kind of a world with advantages and disadvantages, and a lot of the disadvantages have to do with the depletion of the earth.
Yes.
And so can we include that element into the idea of integration? I think all these questions are in the mother's mind when she founds Auroville.
How many people live there today?
Today, there's about 2,500 people that live there. And then there's visitors that are going there in greater numbers. About 1,000 people every year are kind of transient. They come and go.
So it's an experimental community that has now survived 50 years.
That's right. Last year was the 50th year of Auroville.
Yeah. And of course, we know in the history of certainly America and many other countries, experimental utopian style communities, many of them have come and gone.
Quite true. So when we think of this as a utopian experiment, it's really a utopia in the making. Because I think it becomes a utopia when the integration that's being talked about has been achieved. Yeah. And that integration, it's a high demand. It's a tall order, as one may say.
Yeah.
So people are moving towards that. Even psychologically, the mother is describing this integration now in a collective way, which Shri Aurobindo didn't really do. He was talking about an individual integration. So, for example, she's saying that the fulfillment of the community comes when every individual can experience others in the community almost as other bodies of themselves. Can we attain to identity with a collective? So these kinds of spiritual goals can then be extended to the habitat in which I live. Can I experience identity with the earth in which I live? And of course, it looks like a very esoteric idea, but I think the more practical thing is, can we have intimate relationship with those with whom we live, including the world in which the earth on which we live. And I think that progressive movement is current. It's going on in Auroville, and that's what makes it, a vital experiment.
Now, you have described to me how in the very center of the community, there's not a temple, but there is a meditation hall.
Right. So again, talking of a different kind of space, which to some extent the mother was looking at as a model for the future, kind of a city-state, which would be a sort of a kind of a model that people would replicate in some way. She thought of a kind of a city with a soul. And this idea goes back to actually modernism and maybe the early decades of the 20th century in Germany, when people like Bruno Taut and other architects were thinking up spiritual cities, and cities which had a structure at the center that did not belong to any individual, but belonged to the community as a whole. And here there is what's called the Mother's Chamber, or the Mother's Meditation Hall, Matri Mandir, or the Mother's Temple, which is a meditation hall that people can go in and meditate, that belongs to the community as a whole. So it's a beautiful architecturally designed, structure. And there is no specific religious content, but there is symbolic content. It's in a way a solar kind of symbolism. Not only a solar symbolism, but I'd say physically integrated solar symbolism. Because there's a heliostat that tracks the sun and drops a ray of sunlight onto a crystal globe. And there is a large room in which people sit and meditate around that globe. So that one of the contemporary philosophers, Michel Foucault, has talked about a heterotopia. A heterotopia is a place that is at many places at the same time. And the reason it can be that is that individuals can look at it in different ways. It affords a variety of images to people. And I think rich symbolism can do that. And I feel the Mother's Matri Mandir, the soul of Auroville, is a heterotopia in that sense.
You've described to me your own personal experience meditating in this center.
Right.
Could you talk about that?
Yes, indeed. I have meditated there a number of times, and inevitably I go into a very deep space. I think the aesthetics has something to do with it, but it doesn't exhaust the content. And the space makes me feel as if I'm in a very concentrated place in the middle of the earth. It's planetary. It's a sense of being everywhere on the earth at the same time. That kind of an experience is quite unique to that place.
And just for some context, we have never talked about this, but I presume that you have actually quite a bit of experience with meditation.
Yes, I've been meditating for many years. Yes, indeed. And so different kinds of environments afford different types of experiences. And I think the Matri Mandir has quite a unique type of experience. There's a quality of something that is not yet formed.
Obviously, when building a community, ecological considerations are very important.
Yes.
And I gather that at Auroville, they have given this quite a bit of focus.
Indeed. As I said, I think the environment is one of the forms of integration that the mother thought of. And so we find that from the very beginning, this place, this sort of, this plot of land that was selected was completely barren. And it had suffered from the kinds of, desertification or denudation that many places on the earth have suffered now.
And particularly in India.
Due to excessive, tree cutting and cultivation without really renewing the soil, and the inability of trees to grow there, and the runoff due to monsoons. The soil had become completely infertile. And at the same time, there was a banyan tree that the mother selected as the center of Auroville, and she chose 1.6 mile radius around that as the land. And so when the people came to settle there, they had to look at that land as also a part of their extended body. And one of the first things they had to do was to bring back the trees and the water to that land. And I think that has been one of the great success stories of Auroville, the experimentation, the way in which they worked with the indigenous societies over there, the village people who knew more about the kinds of vegetation that grow there, as well as the scientific knowledge that was brought by some of the Western people who settled there. They've managed to green that entire area. So there are forests around the periphery of Auroville, a kind of a green belt. Again, the idea of a green belt goes back to, the 1920s or so, when new kinds of cities were being thought up by modernist thinkers, modernist town planners in Europe. So it's greened, and they've created irrigation projects, catchment systems to bring up the water table, and also they have water recycling, so that very large efficiency of water recycling takes place within Auroville.
And the population there, how many people are native and how many people are foreign?
So I'm not absolutely sure about the proportions, Jeffrey, but I'd say about 50-50. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What happened is earlier there were villages within that 1.6 mile radius, and so the villages were, and the mother asked the villagers be looked at as the original inhabitants of Auroville. So the people who came to settle around those areas came into contact with the villages.
Because the ashram itself was attracting people from all over the world.
That's true. And Auroville, being set up as an international community, a lot of the hippies that came in the 60s gravitated towards Auroville. So there was, European and American influx, while there were Indians as well who went there. And then the villagers who got incorporated or assimilated into Auroville. So it is this kind of hybrid population that lives there.
Another point is that they have worked to create a balance in terms of using technology, but not becoming overwhelmed by the technological mindset.
Exactly. I think that's a really important point, Jeffrey. And I think that's another one of those both reasons why it has managed to last so long, and one of the reasons why it holds some promise for the future. I think most of these communities, utopian communities that have tried to find a solution to the over kind of, consumerism of the world, have tended towards becoming kind of communities that have divorced themselves from technology, communities that are a back to nature type of movement. But in Auroville, what has happened is that they have focused rather on spiritual growth. Growth in integration, and those become their vectors of engagement, so that the technology does not override their existence, but is integrated into those concerns. And so it uses technology for relations with the earth, relations with each other, relations of culture, things of that kind, without becoming capitalized in the sense that the rest of the world is.
Now, the Aurobindo Ashram is still active in Pondicherry, separate from Auroville.
Yes.
Is there a relationship?
Well, Auroville was created to start with as an independent unit, and the ashram exists as another unit, and the ashram has a slightly different flavor to it, which is a little more religious, because I think the people of the ashram gravitate around the physical personalities of Shri Aurobindo and the Mother. Their samadhi, which is their tomb, the place where their bodies have been interned, becomes a sacred spot around which people sit and meditate. And there's a lot of devotionalism towards the personalities of Shri Aurobindo and the Mother in the ashram, while in Auroville that's kept to a minimum. So the relations between these two communities could have made for a very interesting kind of dialogue. But, some of that has happened, but there was an unfortunate history in which a certain unit that was affiliated with the ashram, the Shri Aurobindo Society, came into conflict with the residents of Auroville. And as a result of that, that conflict, the government of India had to come in and segregate the two communities. And now Auroville is legally speaking, owned by the government of India. Of course, the government doesn't interfere in its operations. It has a representative that keeps watch over it, but allows it to run by itself.
So the community is operating on principles that were originally enunciated by Mira Alfassa.
Yeah, and actually by Shri Aurobindo in his social and political writing. So, as I said, he was looking at forms of government, and as we also discussed, he was an anti-colonial activist to start with, and he was critiquing some of the forms of government and looking towards a radical democracy. And he felt that a radical democracy had to be a participatory democracy, not a representative democracy. So this moves us towards forms of government that have been called anarchistic. So he was looking at a kind of an anarchistic, self-governing city unit. And to get to that point, Auroville has he felt that that was only truly possible when we could psychologically arrive at sources of consensus. And that is a spiritual goal. But before we can get there, society ought not to be top-heavy, that not to be governed by a kind of a dictatorship or some kind of small number of people, controlling the others. And so what, he was foreseeing a kind of gradual movement towards full participation. So what we have right now is a kind of a three-tier system. There is a what's called a governing board, consisting of a few of the members, senior members of Auroville, and some other people who are visionaries in a sense. Then there is also an international advisory committee, and then there is a working committee formed of 7 members chosen by the members of Auroville. And then there is the entire population of Auroville above the age of 18. And that total population is what really has the last say on any principles that are proposed at any level of this three-tier system. And of course, it sounds a little unwieldy. How would 2,500 people decide? But actually, we have to see that Auroville is an organic system of many different smaller communities. And each of these small communities has its own self-governing processes. So smaller decisions are taken by people by themselves, while larger community decisions are taken by the entire
yes,
population.
As you described it to me earlier, it's as if there are villages within Auroville.
That's right. There are villages, and see, this was Shri Aurobindo's vision of future governance, that organically people would congregate into what we might call global villages that were not the villages of the past, that were clans that had congregated due to blood relations, but villages of the future that were international affinity groups, people who had come together to do some work, or because they had affinity with each other, or intentions they shared, and these formed organic units that were self-governing.
And also had different economic enterprises, I gather.
Right. So there is an economic base, and again, the idea was to have cottage industries. And cottage industries, as we discussed, there isn't the absence of technology. So the cottage industries are sometimes technological. Auroville had one of the first desktop computer assembly units in all of India. There are sometimes smaller, low-tech cottage industries, like incense making or textiles and things like that. And some of the industries are service industries. For example, even the people who have created a green belt are now giving consultancy to other places on how to regenerate the land. So you have a variety of industries that support Auroville. And work becomes really an opportunity for individuals to express their creativity in a way that is of service to the entire community.
So in effect, one might say Auroville is an experiment in Karmayoga.
Absolutely. I think that's an important aspect of the, ground reality of Auroville. Everybody there is doing a certain kind of karma yoga because they offer their work to the entire community, but they do it in a way which is satisfying, in a way in which they are organically accepted for what they have to give. And that was part of the mother's vision, that people ought to be supported by the community and they ought to support the community to the level of their capacity. In a way, I mean, some of the Marxist ideals find their fulfillment in a place like Auroville.
Well, in some ways,
to each according to his needs, from each according to their capacity.
It's reminiscent of some of the Israeli communes.
That's true. That's true. I think one of the differences here is that as the mother laid it out in her, charter, which forms the ideals of Auroville, the first one says, Auroville does not belong to anybody in particular. Auroville belongs to humanity as a whole. So this sense of property, of holding to something that one owns, is divested from one's mind from the very beginning. That we are here to give ourselves to a human ideal, ideal belonging to humanity. The second one is Auroville is a place of unending education. And this notion of unending education is, I think, really important because individuals are involved in a process of becoming integrated, in transcending themselves, and in learning about themselves and about their environment, about cultures and things like that. So that becomes the primary goal rather than having, being and becoming, rather than owning and having, is really the big shift in the psychological, state of being of people there.
You mentioned that the government of India now owns Auroville, but I gather people do own their own homes.
Right. I think when we use the word own, we again come back to the notion of property. But I think ownership, by saying the government of India owns Auroville, I think legally speaking, that's what that means. But I think independence is given to them to run their community. An individual who goes to Auroville and is integrated into Auroville has the power to purchase a home for themselves. In other words, they can have a home built there for themselves. and that home does not actually technically belong to them. They can live there for their entire life, and if they have people living with them, those people can live there too. But once they leave, that house becomes the property of the community.
I see.
So, they have working groups that can decide who will go there. You can't sell the home in which you've built.
So it's not strictly a capitalist society at all.
No, it isn't. In fact, one of the tenets that the mother was looking towards is a money-free society. And even now, I think people who live there, though they exchange with the outside world economically using money, internally there is a kind of almost a credit system through which people accrue credits according to the work they do and the services they give, etc. And with that, they can also buy, their daily needs.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, since the community has survived now for half a century, and you bring groups of students there to visit?
Yes, I will be taking 15 students in this July.
So obviously you see this as a role model that people around the world should pay attention to.
Absolutely. I think the students that I take are graduate students that are going to write research papers looking at a variety of, looking at the holistic society, but they can look at it through the lens of its economy, its ecology, its spirituality, or its architecture, its culture, a variety of ways, so that one sees how it has integrated these into the society.
Mm-hmm. Well, Debashish, thank you for this conversation. This has been very informative about a significant social development of which I and probably most of the viewers are largely unaware. So you have gifted us with your experience and knowledge.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Thank you, and thank you for being with us.